So why do I always say so? I don't know. In the month of April, it's pandemic central. My anxiety likes to manifest itself into a little restlessness, inability to concentrate. So I was light on my reading this month. I read Michelle Obama's Becoming, and I read short stories about apocalyptic scenarios or post-apocalyptic scenarios, because why not reinforce those feelings? So first I read Michelle Obama's Becoming, and spoiler alert, it's a great book. Oprah says so, tons of people say so, I say so. I was very pleasantly surprised by what a well-written book it is. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. The woman went to Harvard. She's a lawyer. She's very accomplished in her own right. I don't know why I think rich and famous people maybe aren't going to be the most articulate on their own, that they have other people do things for them. But that's not the case. Michelle Obama, my initial impressions of her as a first lady, being focused on wellness and children's services and being such a strong, dignified, amazing person unto herself, was only reinforced by these books. She's also a really good writer. So the book is in 3 separate sections. It's kind of Becoming Me, which is more about her childhood and upbringing. And then the next section is really about Becoming Us, which was her and Barack, her husband, the former president, still my president in my heart, their relationship growing up, and then Becoming More, which is kind of where she was finding her footing as far as the platforms and undertakings that she wanted to take on as the First Lady. Becoming Me probably resonated the most with me. The writing was really beautiful and nostalgic about her family. She grew up in Chicago, definitely working class. Her father had MS, and he worked right up and literally until the end of his life, sort of didn't let his physical issues hold him back. He wasn't a complainer. He worked really hard, but he also maybe didn't take as good of care of himself as he could have. Fear or distrust of doctors and the government perhaps led into that. Her mom was also a very hardworking lady, really dedicated herself to her and her brother. It seems like Michelle Obama was sort of a pistol from the beginning, that she took on kind of teachers and her grandfather for not being very nice to her grandmother. She was really an interesting person. The writing was really beautiful in this section as well. Very articulate. Her description of riding in her father's Pontiac that he loved so much was really touching to me. I also really liked a section where she was talking about, I believe it was her mother's father, who they called Southside. Even though I was small, he put no restrictions on what I could touch. He'd later buy me my first album, Stevie Wonder's Talking Book, which I'd keep at his house on a special shelf he designated for my favorite records. If I was hungry, he'd make me a milkshake or fry us a whole chicken while we listened to Aretha or Miles or Billy. To me, Southside was as big as heaven, and heaven, as I envisioned it, had to be a place full of jazz. And I just thought that was really lovely and poignant to me. I also had a very close relationship with my grandfather, and that love really shines through. And that's something that's really enriching about her entire childhood, is that she was obviously very loved and encouraged. The people in her family really gave her credit, saw her, she felt very connected to them. You can also see kind of resonant throughout the book her love and faith in Barack, both as a leader and her husband, the father of her children. And she talks about kind of his optimism and the place he's coming from of being as sort of a place of abundance. She talks about that when he does some things like letting a deadline slip by for his first novel and then kind of getting his contract canceled. I really appreciated her candor and ability to talk about Barack, not just as like this icon, but as a real person, how his political races and the ambitions that he took on, how they impacted her family. And I thought her as his wife and his children, and how that kind of took over their lives. And I think it's admirable how frank and forward she was about that. She also talks about her relationships and friendships with women, the mentorship that she had, her admiration she speaks about for women who knew their own voices and were unafraid to use them. They didn't second guess the power in their own points of view, which I think is really, there's definitely like strong feminist themes throughout this book that really registered with me. She also really took ownership for her own growth and sort of the becoming us section, talking about how like resentment grew in her relationship with Barack as kind of his life sort of dominated hers. He seems like a really laid back, sort of messy, sort of loose with timelines, and how through counseling she began to see, to quote, how I'd been stoking the most negative parts of myself, caught up in the notion that everything was unfair, and then assiduously, like a Harvard-trained lawyer, collecting evidence to feed that hypothesis. I now tried out a new hypothesis. It was possible that I was more in charge of my happiness than I was allowing myself to be. I was too busy resenting Barack for managing to fit workouts into a schedule, for example, to even begin figuring out how to exercise regularly myself. And she goes on to say how that shifted when she kind of took ownership of that narrative and started working out, started prioritizing her own health, and then established boundaries. Like she set up a schedule for her and the girls, and that schedule was ironclad. And she goes on to say like how important that was to her to instill with her children. She didn't want them to believe that life began when the man of the house arrived home. They didn't wait for dad. It was his job to catch up with them. And I really like that. Some other points that I liked from this, she talks about bullies in the context of sort of some of the criticism that she faced while Barack was on his kind of a political ascent, and she was speaking out at rallies kind of as a proxy for him, how she faced a lot of criticism, sexist-based criticism about her being too militant. And she talks about how bullies were scared people hiding inside scary people, lashed out because they felt overwhelmed. And how the key she found was to not to take any of it personally, to realize that it was coming from a place of fear. But she does note sort of the misogyny and the double standard, that the things she was getting criticized for were things that Hillary Clinton or Nancy Pelosi, any women in power, characteristics that are deemed acceptable for men, the same characteristic is not permissible for women, and how the easiest way to disregard a woman's voice is to package her as a scold. Other really sort of poignant moments in the book, the description of the inauguration made me teary. I remember what a hopeful, exciting time that was, how good I felt about that when it was coming up. Just little fun sort of details from the time that they were in the White House, how the White House has to use a multitude of different grocery shoppers who go out different times to different stores so that no one knows that that food is ending up at the White House. And that interesting detail that the president pays for food, like household goods like toilet paper. and any guests that they have. So they live in the residence for free and they have the utilities paid for, but how those other things can kind of add up because it's all like really high quality. And I just really enjoyed that, her noting that they're buying the expensive toilet paper, and how she'd need to watch sort of the budget for things. Also noticing the lack of diversity in governance, both from a gender standpoint and a race standpoint. She goes on to talk more about Donald Trump and his run, and how I think a feeling that a lot of women had was just the lack of decency there, particularly when the footage of him describing essentially a sexual assault on a woman in 2005 was dismissed. The standards of decency were simply lowered in order to make room for the candidate's voice. How it was like shocking to her as a woman and the first lady to hear that. And then there was something painfully familiar in the menace and the male jocularity of that tape. It simply was a person from a place of privilege who gets away with what he gets away with. And we've all heard the stories, whether it's Matt Lauer or Harvey Weinstein, of just, it's an open secret that these men abuse their position of power to intimidate people in lesser stations. So she's talked about really that it's their expressions of hatred, and that people like Donald Trump feel like they can afford to be cavalier about the way they talk about other people. And she says, every woman I know recognized it. Every person who's ever been made to feel other recognized it. Dominance, even the threat of it, is a form of dehumanization. And she talks again about just sort of how women are familiar with that form of intimidation, whether it's catcalls, whether it's groping, it's assault, it's oppression. These things injure us. They sap our strength. Some of the cuts are so small they're barely visible. Others are huge and gaping, leaving scars that never heal. Either way, they accumulate. We carry them everywhere, to and from school and work, at home while raising our children, at our places of worship, anytime we try to advance. And I mean, again, these things were really resonant for me. So, but she does end on sort of a positive note. She talks about sort of that thread of what she found so appealing from Barack for years was his optimism, his coming from this place of abundance, and how it's something that's instilled in her. It's something that children have innately. They wake up each day believing in the goodness of things, in the magic of what might be. And that kind of is the thread that ties the book together and then ends. So I found it to be a really positive, well-written, good read. The next book I read is in the theme of apocalypse. It's called Wastelands, Stories of the Apocalypse by edited by John Joseph Adams. And it's another book of short stories. I got it from my stepmother again, passing it along. I think I might have read a couple of these before, but I'll kind of point out some of the ones that I liked the most. One was called When Sysadmins Ruled the Earth by Cory Doctorow, and it's about a network administrator or systems administrator who, on the day that a megabug is released, is called into work. After a few hours after he's called into work, he realizes that he gets a call from his wife who says their young child has died and she's dying herself, and sort of how those uber nerds attempt to restore order and change the planet. Next one I really enjoyed was called Inertia by Nancy Kress. And she talks about, it's the story of victims of a disfiguring epidemic who are interned in the modern equivalent of leper colonies. And that one was really interesting because it's years and years after these leper colonies have been established. Doctors have come in at different times to try to study. They realize the disease really isn't advancing, but one set of doctors, I guess, realizes that there is like a brain affect or change that happens due to the disease as well, that the people in the colony, instead of dying out, which was kind of the prediction, their society has in some ways flourished, and they're interested in potentially infecting the outside world, which is much more violent. So another interesting one. Then we have Speech Sounds by Octavia E. Butler, and Octavia Butler has written some of my favorite books. She's got two particularly really good ones. I'll put them up here. And in this world, there's been some sort of change where most people have lost the ability to speak, read, and write. Not everybody has been affected. The people that have been affected tend to behave violently towards one another, but if they realize that you're someone who does not have that issue, they tend to react violently towards you. So this is a woman who's kind of on the edge of despair, who is potentially going to go see family, but she can't necessarily read street signs or even maps to know how to get there. Next one I really enjoyed was called Ginny Sweet Hips Flying Circus, and it's in a post-apocalyptic world, and Ginny Sweet Hips has a traveling roadshow that makes its living selling sex, tacos, and dangerous drugs. And there's mutated possums and mutated dogs and traveling from town to town. So I enjoyed the female protagonist and sort of the different spin. It was sort of jovial, which you don't always get in post-apocalyptic stories. And then the last one that I'll really note is called Episode 7, Last Stand Against the Pack in the Kingdom of the Purple Flowers by John Langan. And I really enjoyed this one. The protagonists are a man and a very pregnant woman who are on the run from what they describe as the pack, which you later come to realize is a pack of dog, wolf-like creatures. And they've been on the run for some time. I feel like they're kind of comic book themes throughout it. The woman is seeing something mysterious, a mysterious shadow or darkness in the man as he's changing. They pass they're not seeing a lot of other people. They pass a lot of abandoned cars that have these vines and purple flowers growing out of them, but they're not seeing corpses or bodies or remnants of people. So that sort of strangeness alluded to. But this was a good distraction and kind of good as my attention span wasn't great this month. To be able to pick up and put something back down. I always like short stories and that it's giving me authors that I can, call on later. So, not bad. This one was good too. I hope to read more in the coming month and I'll report back. Thanks for watching. If you have any recommendations, post-apocalyptic, feminist, inspirational, I'd love to hear them. Feel free to comment below. If this is useful content to you, please give it a like and consider subscribing. Thanks.